The story I'm about to tell you isn't straightforward. Some parts will feel scattered, some things won't make sense halfway through. That isn't an accident. It's the nature of the story itself. Stay with me until the end. That's where everything comes together. And that's when you'll understand why it had to be told this way. I worked seasonal trail maintenance in Blackwood State Forest for 2 summers and 1 autumn before I finally asked the question that ended my contract. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened, because the strangest part was never any single moment. It was the way ordinary procedure kept folding around itself like a map that had been refolded too many times by people who weren't quite paying attention. The first thing I noticed 3 weeks into my first season was that the trailhead sign at the eastern entrance listed 17 marked trails. The laminated map inside the ranger station listed 16. The official PDF I had downloaded onto my phone before orientation listed 15. None of these documents were dated. When I mentioned it to my supervisor, a woman named Devin, who had worked there for 11 years, she said the signs got updated on different schedules and that I should trust the laminated map in the station. I asked which trail was the extra one on the outdoor sign. She looked at it for a long time and then said she would get back to me. She never did. That was the beginning. I didn't think of it as the beginning at the time. I thought of it as bureaucracy. State forests run on small overlapping documents that almost never agree, and I had worked at 2 other parks before Blackwood, and at both of them the paperwork had been slightly wrong in slightly different ways. I assumed Blackwood would be the same. I assumed the 17th Trail was a holdover, a route that had been decommissioned and never scrubbed from the outdoor sign, and that if I waited long enough, someone would eventually repaint the board. The forest itself was beautiful in a way that I want to describe accurately because I think the beauty was part of how it worked on you. It was a hardwood forest, mostly oak and beech, with stands of hemlock in the wetter draws. The understory was open enough to walk through almost anywhere. The light, when it came down through the canopy, came down in long, soft columns that moved when the wind moved, and the air smelled like wet bark and something faintly mineral, like a creek bed in summer. People came from 3 states to hike there. The visitor logs showed roughly 40,000 day use entries per year. The forest covered just under 19,000 acres, which is large for a state forest in that region, but not unusual. What was unusual, and what I learned slowly, was the way the rangers talked about the interior. They never used the word interior. They used the phrase past the second ridge. They used it the way people in old factories used to talk about the back of the shop floor, as if it were a place that existed but didn't need to be discussed. New hires were assigned to the outer trails for at least 1 full season before they were rotated to anything past the second ridge. I was told this was for safety because the inner trails had less cell coverage and more elevation change. That was true. It was also incomplete. I had been at Blackwood for about a month when I realized that none of the rangers I worked with had ever, in casual conversation, described a specific feature of the interior. They had not mentioned a creek, a lookout, a stand of old growth, a meadow, a rock formation, a campsite. People who work in forests talk about features. It's the texture of the job. The rangers at Blackwood talked about weather, paperwork, equipment, and the parking lot. When they talked about the interior, they talked about it as a category, not as a place. In my 5th week, I found a maintenance request in the shared folder on the station computer. The request was for the replacement of a trail marker on a route called Cooper's Cut. I had never heard of Cooper's Cut. It wasn't on any of the 3 maps. The request was dated 2 days before I read it, signed by a ranger whose name I didn't recognize, and listed a GPS coordinate that I copied down. When I went to look at the request again the next morning, the file was gone. Not edited. Gone. The folder showed the same number of files it had shown the day before, but Cooper's Cut was no longer among them. I checked the recycle bin. I checked the version history. The computer behaved as if the document had never existed. I told myself that someone had cleaned up an outdated request. I told myself that the file had been moved to a different folder. I told myself a lot of things during those first weeks. I was 26 years old. I had student debt I was trying to outrun, and I needed the job to last through the season. I was very good at telling myself things. The GPS coordinate I had copied down sat in my notebook for 9 days before I went looking. I went on a Sunday on my own time, with a day pack and a paper map I had marked myself. The coordinate placed Cooper's Cut about 1.5 miles past the second ridge, in a section of the forest that, according to every official document, contained no trails at all. I expected to find nothing. I expected to feel foolish. I found a trail. It was narrow, older than the maintained routes, and edged with the kind of low stone cairns that trail crews used to build in the 1930s before the federal markers came in. The cairns were intact. The tread was packed and clear of leaf litter in a way that suggested regular foot traffic. About 200 yards in, I found a wooden trail marker nailed to a beech tree at chest height. The marker was new. The wood was unweathered, the paint was bright, and the route name burned into it read, Cooper's Cut in clean block letters. I took a photograph. I walked another 1/4 mile, decided I had pushed my luck far enough for a Sunday, and turned back. When I got home that night, the photograph was on my phone. I looked at it 3 times before I went to bed. In the morning, the photograph was still there, but the marker in the image read a different name. It read Lower Hemlock Spur. Same tree, same nail pattern, same angle of light, different name burned into the wood. I want to be clear about this part because I have thought about it many times since. I did not misread the marker in the forest. I had stood within 3 feet of it. I had run my thumb over the burned letters. The photograph on my phone in the morning was not the photograph I had taken, but it was, in every other respect, the same image. The metadata matched. The timestamp matched. The location tag matched. Only the lettering had changed. I checked the photograph's file hash because I had taught myself to do that once for a different reason, and I still had the app on my phone. The hash was different from the hash I had recorded the night before when I had, almost without thinking, written it down in the back of my notebook. The file had changed. The system reported it as the same file, but the file had changed. I did not tell anyone. I started a private log on a notebook I kept in my truck. The second anomaly I logged was about footage. The ranger station had 4 exterior cameras, one at each corner of the parking lot, recording continuously to a local server. Devin had shown me how to pull clips during my orientation because we sometimes needed them for incident reports. In my 7th week, a hiker named Marla reported that she had returned to the lot to find a long scratch down the driver's side of her car. She wanted to file a claim. I pulled the relevant window of footage. The camera covering her parking space had recorded the entire afternoon without interruption. Marla's car was visible the entire time. No one approached it. The scratch was not on the car when she parked. The scratch was on the car when she returned. In between, nothing happened. I watched the footage 3 times. I slowed it down to quarter speed. I checked the timestamps for any skip or cut. There was no cut. The car simply sat there for 4 hours and 12 minutes, and at some point during that interval, a scratch appeared on its door without any visible cause. I showed the clip to Devin. She watched it once, with no change in her expression, and then she said, "Tell her we don't have footage." I asked why. "Because we don't have footage of anything that would help her," Devin said. "That's all the report needs to say, war." I told Marla we didn't have footage. She was angry. She left. I went back to the server that night and looked for the clip again. The clip was still there, but the 4-hour window now showed nothing. Not nothing as in static, or nothing as in a black screen. Nothing as in the parking space was empty. Marla's car had been removed from the recording. The cars on either side were still there. The shadows on the asphalt moved the way shadows move when a car is parked between them, but the car itself was gone, and the shadows fell on bare pavement as if they belonged to a vehicle that wasn't in the frame. I did not show this to Devin. I started keeping a second notebook, this one in a locked drawer in my apartment, and I started writing down every inconsistency I could find in the station's records. The list grew faster than I expected. Trail counts that varied by document. Incident reports that referenced events I could not find logged anywhere else. A maintenance schedule that listed weekly inspections of a structure called the East Cistern, which did not appear on any map and which no ranger I asked had ever inspected. The schedule had been updated as recently as the previous Friday. Someone was checking on the East Cistern. The signature on the inspection sheet was a name I didn't recognize, written in the same handwriting as the names on 3 other inspection sheets, each signed by a different person. The handwriting detail was what made me stop sleeping well. I am not a graphologist. I have no training in handwriting analysis. But the loops on the lowercase e's were identical across the 4 signatures, and the way the pen pressed harder at the end of each name was identical, and the slight rightward tilt was identical. And one ranger does not produce 4 different signatures with that level of consistency unless he is signing for people who are not there. I want to talk now about the rangers themselves, because this is the part that took me the longest to see. There were, according to the staffing list, 11 full-time rangers at Blackwood. I worked with 7 of them regularly. The remaining 4 were always on shifts I wasn't on, or on rotations to the intersections, or on training, or on leave. I never met them. I saw their names on schedules. I saw their signatures on documents. I saw their gear in the back room, labeled with their initials. But I never saw their faces. When I asked Devin about one of them, a man named Hollis, whose locker was next to mine, she said he kept to himself. When I asked another ranger, a man named Pat, who had been at the forest for 6 years, he said Hollis had transferred out of Blackwood the previous spring. When I checked the schedule, Hollis was listed as working the following Tuesday. I started paying attention to the 4 I had never met. Their schedules followed a pattern I couldn't quite name. They were always assigned to the intersections. Their shifts overlapped with each other, but never with the 7 I knew. Their incident reports were always brief, always procedurally correct, and always referenced locations I couldn't find on any map. Mosswell Junction, the old survey line, the lower wash, the bench at marker 14, which on every map I had ended at marker 12. I asked Pat, casually over coffee one morning, what was at marker 14. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "There isn't a marker 14. I said the inspection sheets mentioned 1. He said, "Then it must be a typo." He said it the way you say something you have practiced saying. I want to mention one more thing about the 4 rangers I never met, because it is the kind of detail that I would have dismissed if it had happened only once. Each of them had a coffee mug in the back room. The mugs were arranged on a shelf above the sink, 11 of them in a single row, each one labeled with its owner's name on a piece of masking tape on the bottom. I checked the mugs once during a slow afternoon in August. The 7 mugs belonging to the rangers I knew were used. They had coffee stains on the inside, chips on the rim, scratches in the glaze. The 4 mugs belonging to the rangers I had never met were spotless. They had no stains. They had no chips. They had no scratches. They looked as if they had been bought the day before, but the masking tape on the bottom of each one was yellow with age, and the handwriting on the tape was faded, and the corners of the tape had begun to peel. In my second season, I was promoted to a small supervisory role, which meant I had access to a wider range of the station's records, including the archived incident logs going back to the 1970s. I want to describe what I found there carefully, because it's the part that changed how I understood what I was working inside of. The archived logs showed that Blackwood had been the site of 143 reported disappearances since 1974. Most were eventually resolved. People had gotten lost, or had hurt themselves and been found, or had wandered out a different entrance and forgotten to check in. 12 of the cases were never resolved. That number 12 is not unusual for a forest of that size over 50 years. What was unusual was the pattern. The 12 unresolved disappearances had all occurred in the same general area, past the second ridge, in the section of the forest that contained no marked trails. They had occurred at roughly 5-year intervals. The most recent had been in 2019. The reports were brief, professional, and identical in structure. Each one referenced a search effort that had been called off after 72 hours. Each one referenced a final known location that was given as a GPS coordinate rather than a place name. I plotted the 12 coordinates on a map. They formed an irregular ring about 2 miles across around a central point that, on my paper map, contained nothing at all. The central point, when I overlaid it on the maintenance schedule, was the location of the East Cistern. I went back to the archive a second time, 2 weeks later, to copy down the names of the 12 people who had disappeared. I wanted to look them up, see if any of them had been found, and the records simply not updated. See if any of them had families I could quietly reach. When I opened the archive on the second visit, the folder containing the unresolved cases held 11 files, not 12. I counted 3 times. I checked my notebook. The notebook still listed 12 names. One name was no longer in the system. I will not write that name down here because I do not know what writing it down would do. I went to the East Cistern in late September of my second year. I want to be clear that I did not go alone, and I did not go without telling anyone. I told Pat I was scouting a new section for a possible reroute, and I asked him to mark my truck on the lot board so someone would know when I had left. He looked at me and said, "Don't go past marker 12. Then he turned away. I went past marker 12. The trail past marker 12 was not a trail in the maintained sense. It was a route. It was something you could follow if you knew to look for the cairns. The cairns past marker 12 were older than the ones on Cooper's Cut, and they were spaced more carefully, and they were taller. They came up to my hip. They were built of flat creek stones stacked without mortar, and they did not lean, and they did not collapse under my hand when I tested them. They had been built by someone who knew what they were doing, and they had been built recently enough that no moss had grown on the upper stones. About halfway in, I passed a wooden bench. It was set just off the route on a small flat shelf of ground facing west. The bench was new. The wood was clean and untreated. A small brass plate on the back of the bench, read in memory, with no name. I stopped to look at it. I took a photograph. When I looked at the photograph that night, the brass plate in the image was empty. No engraving at all. The bench, on every later visit I made in my mind, had been there. I never went back to confirm. The East Cistern was at the bottom of a shallow draw, about 1.5 miles past marker 12. It was a circular concrete structure, about 12 feet in diameter, sunk into the ground so that its lip stood roughly 18 inches above the leaf litter. A heavy steel cover sat over the opening. The cover was clean. There was no rust on the hinges. A padlock hung from the latch, unlocked, the shackle resting through the loop but not engaged. The inspection sheet from the previous Friday had a checkbox next to the words "seal intact." The checkbox was filled in. I did not open the cover. I want to say that very clearly. I did not open it. I walked around the cistern once, slowly, and I noticed that the leaf litter on the downhill side of the structure had been disturbed in a way that suggested someone had stood there recently. The disturbance was the size of a pair of boots. The boot prints were faint, but visible in the damp soil beneath the leaves. They pointed away from the cistern, toward the deeper woods, and they were spaced unevenly, as if the person who had made them had been walking slowly or carrying something heavy. I followed the prints for about 40 yards before I lost them in a stand of hemlock. I went back to the cistern. I took 3 photographs. I noted the GPS coordinate. I noticed as I was turning to leave a small detail I had missed on my first pass. On the underside of the steel cover, where the cover overhung the lip of the cistern by about an inch, there was a row of small painted numbers. They had been painted in white, in a neat hand, and they were partially obscured by the lip. I crouched down and read them. They were dates. There were 12 of them. They were spaced at roughly 5-year intervals. The most recent was from 2019. The next one, painted in the same white paint and the same neat hand, was a date in the following spring. It was the date my contract was set to renew. I stood up. I walked back to the trailhead. The walk out took 2 hours and 11 minutes. The walk in had taken 3 hours and 40 minutes. I checked my map and my watch and my GPS, and I checked them again, and there was no explanation for the difference. I had walked the same distance. I had taken the same route. The second half had taken less than 2/3 the time of the first half, and I had not been hurrying. When I got back to the lot, my truck was not where I had parked it. It was in the same row. It was 2 spaces over. The marker on the lot board had been moved as well. I asked Pat, when I saw him the next morning, if he had moved my truck. He said no. He said the lot board had not been touched. He said this without looking at the board. In the next few weeks, I tried to be careful. I tried to behave as if nothing had changed. I did my work. I filed my reports. I did not return to the cistern. I did not ask further questions about the 4 rangers I had never met. I told myself that I would finish the season and then I would not come back. The forest did not let me coast. In mid-October, I was assigned to lead a small group of volunteers on a brush clearing project along a stretch of the outer loop. There were 6 volunteers. I checked them in at the trailhead, signed them onto the day-use roster, distributed gloves and loppers, and walked them out to the work site. We worked for about 3 hours. When we walked back, I counted 7 volunteers behind me. I counted twice. I counted a 3rd time slowly, touching each one on the shoulder as they passed me at the trailhead. There were 7. The 7th was a woman in her 40s, dressed in the same volunteer vest as the others, carrying a pair of loppers that matched the ones I had distributed. She thanked me when she passed. She handed me her loppers. She walked to the parking lot. I did not see which car she got into. When I checked the day-use roster, there were 6 names on it, mine plus 6. The 7th did not appear. I asked the other volunteers casually as they were turning in their gloves if they had brought a friend. They all said no. They all said it without hesitation. None of them seemed to have noticed an extra person. I checked the parking lot footage that night. The cameras showed the volunteers arriving in 3 cars. 2 people per car, 6 volunteers. They arrived at staggered intervals throughout the morning. At no point did a 7th person appear in the footage. The footage also showed them leaving. 6 people, 3 cars, 2 per car. The 7th woman did not appear at any point on any of the 4 cameras. But when I scrubbed slowly through the footage of the volunteers walking from their cars to the trailhead, I noticed that the leaf litter on the path moved very slightly in a small disturbance that walked along with the group, about a step behind them, at the height of a person's stride. The disturbance reached the trailhead with them. It did not reach the parking lot on the way back. I went back to the work site the next morning alone, and I counted the cut branches. We had been clearing dense brush, and the volunteers had been working in pairs, and each pair had built its own small pile. I knew because I had checked while we were working that there had been 3 piles. 3 piles, 6 volunteers, 2 per pile. The next morning there were 4 piles. The 4th pile was smaller than the others, and it was set slightly apart, and it had been built with the same care as the others. The cuts on the branches were clean. The loppers I had distributed had made those cuts. I did not tell anyone about the 4th pile. I started to feel around this time that I was being managed, not watched exactly, managed. The way you manage a process that has a known tendency to drift. Devin began assigning me to shorter shifts. Pat stopped having coffee with me in the mornings. The shared folder on the station computer stopped showing me certain files I had previously been able to see. When I asked about the change in access, I was told that the permissions had been adjusted during a routine audit. I asked when the audit had occurred. I was given a date that was 3 days in the future. The forest itself began to feel different to me, although I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I know how it sounds. The trails I knew well began to feel slightly off in ways I could not always specify. A bench that had been on the left side of the trail was on the right. A clearing that had been roughly circular was now slightly oval. A creek crossing that had required 3 stones to cross now required 4. None of these changes were dramatic. None of them, on their own, would have convinced anyone of anything, but they accumulated. They accumulated in a way that suggested someone was making small corrections to a model that I happened to be standing inside of. I started photographing things. I photographed the bench, the clearing, the creek crossing. I photographed the trailhead sign, the laminated map in the station, the official PDF on my phone. I went back a week later and photographed them again. Some of the photographs matched, some did not. The ones that did not always matched each other in the second round. It was as if the inconsistencies were being resolved one by one in favor of a version of the forest I had not previously seen. The trailhead sign by late October listed 15 trails. The laminated map listed 15. The PDF listed 15. They all matched. I checked my notebook, where I had written down the original counts. The notebook still said 17, 16, 15. The notebook was the only place where the discrepancy still existed. I want to describe one more anomaly from that period, because it is the one that, more than any other, made me understand that what was happening at Blackwood was not happening to the forest. It was happening to the records. and the records were being treated as the truth, and the forest was being adjusted to match. On the last Saturday in October, a hiker came into the station to report that he had walked the outer loop and could not find the connector trail to Becker's Ridge. He said he had hiked the loop many times. He said the connector had always been at the same junction, marked by a small wooden sign, and that the junction was still there but the sign was missing, and the connector itself appeared to be overgrown. He asked if we had closed the trail. I told him we had not closed the trail. I told him I would walk out and check. I took a paper map with me. The connector was on the map. I walked the loop. I reached the junction. The wooden sign was missing. The connector trail was not overgrown. It was gone. The forest at the junction was unbroken. The understory was even. The leaf litter was undisturbed. There was no indication that a trail had ever existed there. I walked 20 yards in the direction the connector had once gone. I did not find a tread. I did not find a cairn. I did not find a single cut branch or trimmed root or trampled patch of earth. I walked back to the station. The laminated map on the wall no longer showed the connector. The PDF on my phone no longer showed the connector. The trailhead sign, when I walked out to check, no longer listed Becker's Ridge at all. I had worked on that trail for 2 years. I had cleared its drainage. I knew every switchback. I checked my notebook. Becker's Ridge was still listed in my notebook in my own handwriting, dated from my first week at Blackwood. When the hiker asked me what I had found, I told him the trail had been decommissioned the previous spring, and the sign had probably been removed during the most recent maintenance cycle. He accepted this. He thanked me. He left. I watched him drive out of the lot. I went back inside and I sat at the desk for a long time, and I did not move. In early November, about a week before my contract ended, I was closing up the station alone. It was a Thursday. The last car had left the lot at 4:40. I was doing the standard end-of-day walkthrough, which included checking the back room, the equipment shed, and the small interior corridor that led to the rangers' lockers. The corridor was about 30 feet long, lit by a single fluorescent fixture and lined on both sides with metal lockers. Hollis's locker was on the right, 3 down from mine. The locker was open. It had not been open when I had passed it that morning. I knew this because I had hung my jacket on the hook next to it, and I would have noticed. The locker was open by about 4 inches, and the interior light, which I had not known any of the lockers had, was on. Inside the locker I could see a row of clean uniforms, a pair of boots, a hat on the upper shelf, and a small framed photograph clipped to the inside of the door. The photograph showed a group of rangers standing in front of the station, smiling, in what looked like summer. There were 11 of them. I recognized 7. The other 4 I had never seen before, but their faces were clear and their names, written in small block letters along the bottom of the photograph, matched the 4 names I had been tracking for 2 seasons. The photograph was dated 3 weeks in the future. I closed the locker. I finished my walkthrough. I left the station. I drove home. I did not tell anyone. The next morning, the locker was closed and locked, and Hollis's nameplate had been replaced with a different name, which I did not recognize, and which I did not write down. The new nameplate was made of the same brushed aluminum as the others, and the lettering was etched in the same font, and the screws holding it to the locker were the same brand and the same age as the screws on every other locker in the corridor. There was no indication that the nameplate had been changed recently. There was on the floor below the locker a single small metal shaving, the kind that comes off when you cut new threads into aluminum. I finished my contract. I did not renew. When I turned in my keys, Devin shook my hand and thanked me for 2 good seasons, and she said, in the same calm voice she used for everything, "You were a careful one. We appreciate that." I asked her what she meant by careful. She said, "You stayed on the trails most of the time." She knew. I want to be clear about that. She knew I had gone to the cistern. She knew I had counted the piles. She knew about the photographs and the notebook and the 4th volunteer. She did not seem angry. She did not seem worried. She seemed like a person who had watched this happen before, more than once, and had developed a professional manner for handling it. As I was walking out, she said one more thing. She said, "If anything arrives in the mail, you don't have to respond. Most people don't." I asked her what she meant. She'd already turned away. I drove out of the lot. I did not look back. I have not been back to Blackwood. I do not intend to go back. But I want to mention several things that have happened since, because I think they are part of the same pattern, and I want them on the record somewhere outside my own notebook. The first is that the official Blackwood State Forest map, which I downloaded fresh from the state website last spring, now shows 16 trails, not 15, 16. The 17th Trail, the one that briefly appeared on the trailhead sign during my first season, has not returned. But one of the trails I worked on for 2 years, a short loop called Becker's Ridge, is no longer on the map. The trail is still there. I have a friend who hiked it in March. The trail is maintained, it has markers, it has a sign at the trailhead. It does not appear in any official document. I have checked. The second is that 6 months after I left, I received a piece of mail at my apartment. It was a standard state employment document, the kind they send when you have been recalled for seasonal work. It listed my name, my employee ID, my assigned station, and my reporting date. The reporting date was 3 weeks in the future. The assigned station was Blackwood. The document was signed by Devin. I had not applied for reinstatement. I had not contacted the Forest Service in any capacity. The document was not a form letter. It was personalized, accurate, and current. My new employee ID was different from my old one by a single digit. I did not report. I did not respond. I shredded the document and I changed my address with the post office, and for a year I assumed that would be the end of it. The third is that, about 4 months after I shredded the recall notice, I started receiving direct deposits from the State Forest Service. Small ones. The amount of a part-time seasonal paycheck deposited every 2 weeks into the account I had used during my employment. I called my bank. The deposits were legitimate. The originating account was the state payroll system. I called the state payroll office. They told me I was an active employee. They told me my timesheets had been submitted by my supervising ranger every 2 weeks for the past 4 months. They told me the supervising ranger was Hollis. I told them I had never met Hollis. The woman on the phone paused, and then she said, "He says he works with you every day?" I closed the account. I opened a new account at a different bank. The deposit stopped. 2 weeks later, I received a paper check in the mail for the same amount, drawn on the state treasury, made out to my name. I did not cash it. I keep it in the same locked drawer as the notebook. The fourth is the report. Last month, I received a second document. It was an incident report, professionally formatted on official letterhead. It described an event that had occurred 2 weeks earlier at a location past Marker 12. The report listed the responding ranger as me. It listed my new employee ID. It described the recovery of a personal notebook from beneath a stone cairn near the East Cistern. The notebook was described as water-damaged but legible, and was logged into evidence under my name. The report was signed by Hollis. I have never met Hollis. I have never returned to Blackwood. The notebook I kept during my time there is in a locked drawer in my apartment, and I checked it the night the report arrived, and it was still there. And it was dry, and it was legible, and every page was where I had left it. But when I opened it, the last 3 pages in which I had left blank were no longer blank. They contained a list of GPS coordinates, written in my own handwriting in ink that matched the pen I keep on my desk. I have not been to any of those coordinates. I have not written those numbers. I have compared the handwriting to my own, side by side, and I cannot tell the difference. I plotted the coordinates on a map. They formed an irregular ring about 2 miles across around the East Cistern. There were 13 of them. 12 matched the locations of the unresolved disappearances I had copied from the archive. The 13th was a coordinate I did not recognize. I checked it against the property maps. The coordinate fell on the parking lot of my apartment building on the space where I park my car. I moved the next week. I did not file a forwarding address. I paid the new lease in cash for the first 3 months, under a slightly altered version of my name, and the kind of variation that would not pass a credit check but might confuse a casual database search. I do not know if this has helped. I have not received any further mail. But last Tuesday, when I came out to my car in the morning, the leaf litter on the asphalt around the driver's side door had been disturbed, very slightly, in a small pattern that suggested someone had stood there recently. The pattern was the size of a pair of boots. The boots had been pointed away from the car toward the street, and they had been spaced unevenly, as if the person had been walking slowly or carrying something heavy. I am writing this down now because I want it to exist somewhere that is not the notebook, and not the forest records, and not whatever filing system continues somewhere past the second ridge to update itself in my absence. I want it to exist in a form that has been spoken aloud, that has been heard by someone, that has been pulled out of the quiet administrative space where these things seem to live. I want to say one last thing, and then I want to stop. The 17th Trail on the trailhead sign during my first season, the one nobody could account for, the one that vanished from the documentation over the course of 3 weeks, had a name. I wrote it down in my notebook on my second day at Blackwood. I have not looked at that page in over a year. I looked at it last night while I was preparing to record this. The name on the sign was my own. And below it, in the same notebook, in handwriting I had not noticed before, in ink that had not been there when I had last checked, someone had written the words, Marker 14, Spring. The handwriting was identical to mine. The date next to it was 3 weeks in the future. If you have ever worked somewhere where the records seemed to know more about you than you had told them, and where a small part of the building or the grounds or the system was quietly being maintained in your name by people you had never met, on a schedule that did not include you, I would like to know whether you ever found out who was signing for it. And if you did, I would like to know whether they ever stopped.